When the railroad finally reached the Ligonier Valley in 1877, Judge Thomas Mellon did not expect it to profit. The initial 10 miles snaked through the beautiful forests of the Loyalhanna Gorge, which aside from a few quarry opportunities, provided little in the way of industrial potential. But as Thomas Mellon's sons continued the line into the 20th century, a small but lucrative vein of coal was unearthed just north of Ligonier along Mill Creek. A 5-mile extension was quickly erected to allow trains to reach the recently opened mines and coke works, funneling it all to the steelworks of Pittsburgh. The Ligonier Valley, both in communities and railroad, profited exponentially. By 1910, the town had swelled to a population of over 1,500, with many more boarding in the small patch houses in places like Wilpin along Mill Creek. The recent influx of wealth allowed for the railroad to upgrade its passenger accommodations, establishing a new magnificent station at the heart of their operations on the west end of town. The white granite facade would be the first impression out-of-town passengers would have after being pulled through the industrial sprawl of the west, through the forested gap, and into a mountain playground. 4th of July weekends were especially busy along all 15 miles of the short line, ferrying locals to Latrobe for connection trains that would take them to festivities around western Pennsylvania, as well as guiding vacation-goers through the cooling shade of Idlewild Park, or to relax in the various resorts in downtown Ligonier. It was also popular to find a picnic spot along the Mill Creek branch, whose banks are filled with many fine wildflowers to gawk and lure. 4th of July weekends also exposed faults in operations. Like many short lines with a limited budget, the Ligonier Valley could not afford a turntable. It instead changed the direction of their trains via a three-legged rail triangle called a Y. One Y wrapped around the train station in Ligonier, the other made up the western terminus in Latrobe. This had allowed trains to move smoothly during the quarter of a century of operation, but the addition of the Mill Creek branch complicated matters. The bulk of trains used in this leg were the heaviest, longest, and most important of trains running on the Ligonier line, but the track merely dead-ended at a place called Fort Palmer. With no way to be able to turn, locomotives had to either pull in, reverse, or push the whole consist at least one way along the Mill Creek. The railroad also had very little communication along the line. Only a phone call from a coal office in Wilpin to Ligonier Station could communicate departures and arrivals. The rest had to work off of hand signals and the patience of other trains in holding. Fortunately, the Ligonier Valley Railroad had one of the best crews of any short line at that time. They kept the engines in top of shape, knew their hand signals well, and often kept time of the schedule. For the first quarter of a century of operation, there were barely any blemishes on the line's safety record. July 5th, 1912 landed on a Friday. The weather most likely was hot like it had been on Independence Day. Some of the newspapers at stands along Main Street would have held the first word of the latest calamity that gripped the nation's attention, a terrible train wreck near Corning, New York, that would ultimately claim 39 souls. Elsewhere would have been talks of the Summer Olympics, set to begin in Sweden tomorrow, a Olympics the United States of America would eventually claim 25 gold medals in. But in the Ligonier Valley, the mountains kept most outside talks and worries to a minimum. Life went on, busy, but that was expected for a hot summer day in the valley. 2 passenger trains were scheduled exclusively for the Mill Creek branch that day. The first leaving Ligonier at 6:40 a.m. The second was scheduled for 3:20 in the afternoon. Intermixed were several freights out of the mines, destined for transfer to the Pennsylvania Railroad in Latrobe and on to Pittsburgh. Around midday, however, the timetable was destroyed when one of the wheels of a loaded coal train slipped out of the track. That was no small freight, requiring 2 engines to pull the dozens of cars out of Wilpin. Until the wheel could be slipped back in, no traffic was permitted to move north from Ligonier. Passengers, meanwhile, began to congest under the awning in front of the Ligonier station. Normally, this excursion would only draw a handful of passengers, necessitating only the use of a combination passenger and luggage car. But with the Friday being sandwiched by a holiday and a weekend, it would be nearly a full house inside the coach. Some were going to visit family like 16-year-old Sarah Elizabeth Hoon, known around town as Bessie. There was a large turnout of young children from Ligonier, being taken to pick flowers along Mill Creek by Esther Matthews, a longtime nurse employed by the railroad's general manager. Among the kids were sisters Mary Elizabeth and Louise Roddy. They waited on the platform for their 10-year-old brother William to join them. Maud Holby Overton was returning home to Wilpin from visiting her mother. Her sons Franklin and John were present for the ride home. Their father was a foreman at the Shenango Furnace Company. Conductor Charles Kuhn was a favorite of the railroad in town, having served on the short line for over 30 years. Although Ligonier Valley rule was that the passenger trains always had the right-of-way, he did not want to depart up Mill Creek until he was certain it was clear. Engineer Thomas Dunlap and fireman Walter Byers most likely took the time to further inspect the locomotive, number 10, a Class D11 purchased used from the Pennsylvania Railroad just 2 years prior. Finally, around 3 o'clock, the trick wheel of the coal train had been at last realigned along the rail. The delay had chewed up most of the water in the tenders, making the crew antsy and wanting to return to Ligonier's shops as soon as possible. The conductor of the freight, Harry Knox, took the short walk to the offices of the Shenango Furnace Company to phone to the Ligonier station, requesting the passenger train to be delayed to allow his freight passage. He was seemingly approved, as shortly after 3:20, Engineer Smith Beatty gave the whistle a blow and off they left Wilpon. He and fireman John Ankney were at the helm of the lead engine, a 1889 built Baldwin 460 nicknamed the R.B. Mellon. Both were longtime employees of the Ligonier Valley, Beatty having just purchased a new home for his family in downtown Ligonier. Immediately behind was the slightly larger Class H3 280 number 14, which had just been purchased that February. It was manned by two more of the line's veterans in the form of Frank McConaughey and George Byers. Knox boarded the caboose at the rear of the train as the freight began picking up speed out of the mines and oven yards. In Ligonier, the crowd quickly finished boarding, filling the combination car to capacity with roughly 60 passengers on board. As Bessie Hoon stepped into the car, she found her uncle, George Tosh, had already taken position by the window. Viewing the scenery outside was one of the pastimes of the Civil War veteran. He offered the seat to Bessie, but she declined, taking to the inside seat next to him. Miss Matthews most likely was taking head count of her party of youth who were eager to depart. On time at 3:20, Dunlap guided number 10 and its load of humanity away from the platform, then started the push up the Y. Passengers would see the old card shops to their left. The houses of Ligonier could be seen on the hillside to the east. Then the train made its crossing of Mill Creek, passing into a patch of woods. It then paused at the North Ligonier flag stop to pick up an additional passenger before moving on. Dunlap brought the speed to 12 miles per hour as the train came to the border of a clearing known as Denny's Flats, one of Ligonier's popular fairgrounds and racetracks. Passengers gazed across the field to look at the trees and wagon road bordering the creek bed. Then they disappeared into a patch of timber where they curved sharply around the hillside to cut across Hannah Run. The passenger crew turned instantly into the view of the R.B. Mellon, moving steadily with number 14 at 25 miles per hour. Dunlap threw the throttle into reverse and began frantically tugging at the whistle. He got out 6 blasts of noise before tragedy struck. Riding along the wagon road on the east side of Denny's Flats was Edward Nicely. He saw number 10 in its combination car shoving up the branch line, then witnessed the double-headed coal train plowing through the wooden car, pushing number 10 back some 200 feet. Quickly he rode back into Ligonier to report what he had just seen, what only he had saw. In Wilpon, the sound of a whistle squealing could be abruptly heard, swallowed by the grinding of metal. John Overton knew what it meant, and quickly gathered a group of men and rode off in one of the company's newest automobiles. Nearby farmers followed the streams of steam rising into the air to come upon a ghastly sight that onlooker James Love would claim was worse than what he saw during the Johnstown flood. The R.B. Mellon, upon tearing through the combination car and hitting its framework, had derailed and sagged to the right side of the tracks. Number 14 continued ahead, disintegrating the tender and cab of the lead engine before the force of the hoppers behind it caused the locomotive to derail, jackknife around, and fall upon its left side facing back toward the north. Number 10 was almost entirely untouched, the first responders finding Dunlap and Byers just to be shaken up. But as for the combination car, there was no more combination car. Like smashing an eggshell with a hammer, one newspaper would later describe. Fragments of wood and twisted metal covered the tracks. Human beings moaned and cried for help within the rubble. John Ankney and Smith P. Beatty were likely one of the first pulled from the wreckage. Both had suffered severe lacerations from the wheels of the tender skewing through the cab of the R.B. Mellon. Ankney's legs had been crushed, while Beatty bled out from the neck. It would take time to pry the crew of number 14 from the wreckage, Both had died shortly upon impact. Harry Knox had been rattled in the caboose, suffering terrible bruises and cuts, none of which were fatal. As for his counterpart, Charles Kuhn had leapt from the coach at the last possible moment, breaking both legs upon hitting the ground. As for the passengers in the Twisted Palm Wood, not a single passenger would walk away without some sort of injury. Many had soot and glass embedded deep within their flesh. Some, like George Tosh, did not survive the initial impact. The Roddy sisters were also dead, unable to be saved in time by Ezra Matthews. Matthews, however, managed to save several of her party by ushering them into the baggage side of the coach before impact, then pulling as many as she could free from the rubble. Indeed, there were many still clinging to life, but barely. First responders were civilians who had just rushed to the scene, piled into cars and wagons with whatever first aid they could have at their homes. Wounds could be bandaged, but no serious treatments could be made out in the human muck on the July afternoon. The Ligonier Echo would claim that there were just 2 physicians in Ligonier at the time of the wreck. The nearest medical facility that could handle such a calamity was over 12 miles away by rail in Latrobe. A hospital train was put together in a hurry and rushed to the scene, arriving in the early evening with additional medical help. In the meantime, the first of the injured were hurried into the rooms of the Brenheiser Hotel in the center of Ligonier for temporary care, then loaded on the awaited train. It would take an hour to reach Latrobe, a ride several would not live through. John Overton Sr. had just joined in the rescue, pulling through the wreckage until coming upon his wife. Badly bleeding, she was removed barely conscious from the rubble and carried by John all the way to the awaiting relief train. Maud would quickly succumb to her injuries during the ride to Pittsburgh. Mr. Overton would not leave the side of his wife. Their 2 sons would succumb to their own wounds by the following day. At the station in Latrobe, T.C. Ankney was in the middle of his job as mail carrier when the hospital train arrived at the platform. When he'd first heard word of a wreck in Ligonier, many claimed it to be minor, but Ankney was curious as to his son's whereabouts. Then came the first bodies of the deceased, which included the fireman of the R.B. Mellon, his son John. Co-workers had to restrain and calm the father, as a scene that was repeated as others would recognize loved ones would have passed on by the time they reached the hospital. A hush fell over the town in the coming days, as some of the badly wounded were returned to their homes in a hope that comforts there would aid in recovery. Streets were roped off to keep noisy transportation away. In other homes, mourning of the dead began. Bodies were returned one by one from Latrobe and Pittsburgh hospitals. The next several days would be one funeral after another. And not just in Ligonier. There were deceased needing to be buried in several parts of the western Pennsylvania. The remains of George Tosh would be returned to his hometown in Iowa. The wreck would go on to fill spots in several of the nation's papers, but in Pennsylvania especially, it was the topic of discussion of the week. In all, 23 had been killed, with another 30 or so injured. Partial lists of those involved circulated in every paper. Among those listed as deceased was Bessie Hoon. Hoon was found by attendants amongst a small pile of dead in the lawn of Latrobe Hospital, laid out with the intention of being hosed of the grime before autopsies were to be conducted. One attendant found the unconscious Hoon still had a pulse. She was quickly rushed into a room in the facility to await treatment. Doctors feared they would have to amputate on her severely injured leg. A Dr. Silvis was more optimistic, believing a successful kneecap operation would be enough for recovery. She was not alone in the recovering. At Allegheny General Hospital in Pittsburgh, Ezra Matthews was listed in several reports as unlikely to survive her wounds. Nevertheless, she too managed to make a full recovery. She would be labeled the heroine of the Ligonier Valley wreck. In a nearby hallway, Miss Kuhn grieved over the poor condition her husband arrived in at the hospital. But Charles Kuhn would eventually recover from his many broken bones and provide crucial details of the final moments leading up to disaster. Although it would take just a day for the Pennsylvania Railroad wreck train to remove the locomotives and debris from the track, the questions were just beginning. How could the deadliest rail accident in Westmoreland County occur on one of the safest lines in that county? 3 separate investigations were launched by the Interstate Commerce Commission, by Pennsylvania's Railroad Commission, and by the Westmoreland County Coroner Office. At the center of questioning was General Manager George Sempt. The man who had helmed the railroad for almost its entire history up to that time had only ever lost 2 individuals from accidents on his line. Senf was devastated and racked by regret. His granddaughter among the injured in the party, he commissioned Matthews to take up the line that day. But his refusal to elaborate on his theories of the wreck began to allow the imagination of the public to run wild. Some accused Senf of violating supposed state laws against operating passenger trains in the manner the July 5th excursion was operated. On September 6, 1912, a coroner inquest was held at the Ligonier Springs Hotel. Over 100 officials, lawyers, eyewitnesses, and loved ones of victims sat within the dance hall for the occasion. The county coroner, H.A. McGurry, had taken the entire summer to study the dead and to hear out the findings of the state and national authorities. Many were eager to hear the testimony of two particular figures, Russell Minnick and Frank Knoll. Minnick was the railroad's assistant manager, Knoll the railroad's car distributor. Both also doubled as the railroad's dispatchers at Ligonier. Each had some sort of contact with the trains prior to the wreck. Knoll claimed to have received a call from conductor Harry Knox and, after getting approval from Senf, gave Knox the right-of-way. Knoll claimed he told Kuhn to keep the train at the platform, but shortly after 3:20, Knoll stepped out on the north side of the station to find a passenger train pushing north up the Mill Creek branch. Knoll insisted he tried to signal the crew, but was not properly understood. Minnick confirmed Knoll's statement of receiving Knox's call, then claimed to have twice told Kuhn to hold the train, but didn't get a clear response. One of eyewitnesses to Minnick's testimony claimed Kuhn coldly replied, "To hell with the freight," before ordering passengers aboard. Kuhn, bound to a wheelchair during the inquiry, denied using such language, that he was busy with paperwork to have spotted Minnick or Knoll from afar, and that he did not see Knoll signaling him to stop. Baggage master Edward Raffnell, the only person to not be injured in the wreck, supported Kuhn by stating he had never seen either dispatcher inside or near the coach talking to Kuhn. Kuhn did admit this had only been the second or third time in his career that he had been in charge of a train pushed in front of the engine toward Wilpon, that the train could have easily been turned on the Y to be engine first. After a day of hearings and an hour for the jury to confer, a verdict was reached. We further find that the said wreck occurred through the negligence of the Ligonier Valley Railroad Company in operating this road without using written orders, without the certainty and verification of verbal orders, without employing a signal code or having a system of signals along its lines, without using tracknik signals, without proper instruction, rules, or signals to their employees, and lastly, without any recognized up-to-date methods of operating the railroad. Although not found of personal responsibility, the guilt did not leave Senf conscious. When widows like Myrtle Ankney came seeking compensation for the devastating losses, the Ligonier Valley Company did not fight. She asked for $18,000 in damages, settling for $6,500. The Hoon family received nearly $3,000 in compensation for medical costs. Many more lawsuits would end in similar manner. Change would swiftly come to the railroad in the valley. In 1913, Senf stepped down as general manager. He passed away the following year. The railroad also had acquired the funding to install phone lines for the entire length of their right-of-way. The railroad began using written orders on a daily basis. By 1917, the passenger service along the Mill Creek branch was discontinued, making way for larger loads of coal and coke in time for the First World War. And in a bedroom in Fairfield Township, one survivor battled with the wounds of that day. Though young Alice Rittenauer had survived the wreck, doctors could not help her make a full recovery. She was returned to her home where she sat in a bed for 2 agonizing years. Family and nurses tried to make her as comfortable as possible, as bits of glass lodged deep in her skin would occasionally work their way to the surface. On March 8, 1914, her agonizing final years came to an end at age 15. She would be the final confirmed death linked to the wreck. Bessie Hoon would receive a silver kneecap and spend much of 1912 recovering. The operation went so well that she never suffered from a limp. She would remain in the Ligonier Valley for the rest of her life, marrying, having a family, and being a longtime school teacher. It is said her skin was still marked with soot permanently embedded from the wreck. She kept the dress she wore that day until her death in 1964. The wreck at the Blind Curve north of Ligonier, Pennsylvania was one of three awful train wrecks to occur in July of 1912, all stemming from miscommunication and outdated signaling. Reforms would be made throughout the country, reforms that are now considered standard amongst rail transportation in the United States. For the Ligonier Valley Railroad, it continued to operate for another 40 years. 40 years free from any catastrophic accidents. In all, 9 million tons of freight were hauled by the Ligonier Valley Railroad, with many passengers brought to and from. When the tracks were pulled at the end of its service, so too went the memories of the railroad and the wreck. Today, Ligonier remains a jewel in the mountains of western Pennsylvania. However, much has changed in appearance. The Brennheiser Hotel has been replaced by Town Hall. The Ligonier Springs Hotel was lost to fire and replaced with a Ramada. The train station still stands, with little change on the surface since the day it was built. The platform now serves as a carport for the school administrations held inside. The patch of Wilpon still remains, as do some of the coke ovens. One just needs to know where and when to look. In 2010, the Ligonier Valley Railroad Museum opened in their new location inside a restored train station on the western edge of Idlewild Amusement Park. It houses artifacts from the railroad's 75 years of history, educating visitors how the short line changed the course of the valley's history. Among the artifacts is the dress of Bessie Hoon. It has been washed many times, but still retains tears from the wreck. If one travels north along Route 711, you will come to what was Denny's Flats. A ballpark and soccer field now take hold over the former racetrack. A walking trail dead ends at the very edge of the property, at a new marker that tells the story to curiosity seekers of the often forgotten train wreck of July 5, 1912.